So let's go back to this video that alleges that the British Empire is not that bad of an empire because slavery happened everywhere. Remember, this is not about politics, this is about history. And this guy, the only reason I'm reacting to this video is because he's lying about history.
This self-criticism that we see about the nation, why is it that in Western civilization we have so much trouble with nationhood?
You've spent 60 years teaching your children to hate your own civilization. Why are you surprised that they hate your civilization?
This is the worst switch I've ever seen. The first guy asks the question, why is there so much criticism about their civilization? He switches it to hate. Criticism is not hate. It's okay to fully criticize a nation, and that's really how the nations become better. But let's go into the hate part that he's trying to talk about. Uh, there's no reason to hate the Western world. None. Not even to the people who are victims to the nation's most aggressive policies and their most aggressive acts. Should most people love them? Should Japan be in love with America for bombing them? Also, if you want to talk about hate, why are you pretending that it's the last 60 years? It's funny because 1964, they're pretending like that's the worst hate the West has ever gotten. Okay, let's take one example. Let's take America, right? Literally, the formation of America, if you believe the stories the way they put it, literally America hated being part of the British Empire so much that they separated from the nation. If you want to talk hate for hate, there's hate right there. But I guess that kind of hate is okay.
Sorry, but that's what's
It
happened.
works.
It worked, and absolutely. And by the way, it's not just hate. It's hard to teach people to hate. What's much easier is to lie to them about history.
Firstly, history has already taught us that it's not that hard to teach people to hate. In fact, it's probably very easy. If you compare the number of times that people in history taught people how to hate each other versus how to bond with each other, it's so easy to teach hate that you're literally complaining about it right now. Okay, but that's point number one. Point number two, this video is riddled with lies. So how can you sit there and start talking about people lying when you yourself, which I'm hoping you didn't do enough research, but you yourself are actively lying, or you literally don't know how to use the internet?
So in the UK, for example, in England, there's this. The Church of England, I think, has just approved £1 billion worth of reparations because we talk endlessly about slavery, and
Well, that's the worst interpretation of why anyone would approve reparations. The reason why reparations is approved is because it's owed. That's why they probably approved it. Whether or not you should pay it is really something up to the people, but in real life, it's something that's owed because they did it's to repair what happened in the past. Is that so evil?
narrative on slavery in seems to me to be, there was no slavery, and then the British Empire came along and invented slavery.
This guy is the king of distractions. No one in history has ever said anything that dumb to say, except now, to say that the British invented slavery. No one ever sat down and said the British invented slavery. This is a straw man in order to make it easy to destroy the point. Everybody knows that the Portuguese were one of the first to engage in the slavery that the West, the transatlantic slave trade in a Western sense, then the Spaniards joined in. But before that, everybody knows that the Vikings had slaves and all these other groups, the Sumerians, some Egyptians, Africans. This argument doesn't make any sense. And also, you can easily prove this just by going to Wikipedia. Saying that the West now believes that the British Empire started slavery doesn't make sense when you can literally go to Wikipedia, which is an aggregate of what a lot of scholars think in the West.
And then woke people came along and ended slavery. When, of course, we all know what actually happened, which is slaves were probably the first good that human beings ever traded.
He said the oldest trading good is slavery, which makes no sense. How is that possible? How is it possible for this to be the oldest trade good when the oldest evidence we have of it is about 3200 BC, and we have shells that have been traded from like 25,000 BC? In fact, most estimates estimate that trade goods were there 150,000 BC. I would assume that those things being traded were food and water. How does it make any sense? Like, do we just believe that slavery was not an invention, that human beings just did it for naturally? Do we understand how stupid that is, considering how high maintenance a slave is? They're so high maintenance that people, literally, some slaves die because some people can't take care of them. Not to mention that it's a dangerous profession. You run the risk of your own quote unquote property killing you. I mean, just use your brain a little bit. If you're a slave, especially a captive slave, not one born into it, part of you wants to escape. And there's been hundreds of examples of escaped slaves killing their masters. Saying slavery is the oldest profession, to me, or at least the oldest trading commodity, is the same as saying that farming was the first way that we utilized or got meat. It had to be invented by somebody. And even when it comes to animals, forget humans, animals, we know that you have to somehow capture them and keep them in a location and make them not want to go back to the wild. In fact, most people, most historians, think that it was because of the agrarian, the farming, that we mimicked what we did with the animals to humans. It's actually very logical and easy, and for it to go over this guy's head, I mean, this part, I don't know how you could go over this part and listen to anything this guy has to say on history when he doesn't know such a simple thing.
Never had anything to do with racism, by the way. It was a fact of life that conquered peoples would be subjugated by others and used as labor and would be traded. Native Americans kept slaves, and so did everybody else throughout history.
Now, I don't want to sound like I'm being overly harsh because maybe he meant something different, but since his other arguments sound equally ridiculous, I should just go into it. Okay, so he said everybody else in history kept slaves. No, they didn't. Lots of places in history did not have slaves, even if they had it in their past. Some places had it in the past and they got rid of it several times. This idea that slavery was just something that everyone did and no one saw a problem with it is not true. In fact, it's rare to find slavery in history. The reason why it's rare is because, like I said, slavery is not cheap.
The British Empire practiced slavery just like everybody else. Because of their superior technological advantage, they were able to move slaves across oceans in a way that others weren't.
Because of their superior technological advances, they were able to move people over the Atlantic like others weren't. First of all, people moved people before the British Empire through the Atlantic. In fact, the British Empire was the least productive slave trader in the Atlantic. We have the Portuguese who brought literally millions of people to Brazil. So their technological advantage seems like it didn't help them.
Um, and then the British ended slavery, not only within the borders of their own realm, but also spent a tremendous amount of blood and treasure to force the trans-Saharan slave trade, which was much worse, lasted longer, had a higher death rate.
Another false claim. The idea that the only people in the world who wanted to end slavery was Europeans is dumb. We can use Madagascar as an example, where the Madagascans, the Mauritians, all these islands wanted to stop slavery, but the European powers would try to put in their own vassals in these countries so that they could stop them. Fortunately, in a lot of these places, they lost. And so slavery was stopped early, but then there was hell to pay later. Another false statement he makes is that the transatlantic slave trade was a much easier time for the slaves than it was for the people in the trans-Saharan slave trade. Which, first of all, how does he get to that conclusion? But I will tell you after he finishes his point why this is absolutely incorrect.
The British ended slavery, not only within the borders of their own realm, but also spent a tremendous amount of blood and treasure to force the trans-Saharan slave trade, which was much worse, lasted longer, had a higher death rate. The men were all castrated. The women were taken as sex slaves. They forced that slave trade to end.
So he says that it was way worse to be in the trans-Saharan slave trade. Okay, so first let's deal with the other things that he says. He said that all the men were castrated. Not real. That is not real. They are literal men who have children who were raised under the Islamic Empire and became great Islamic scholars. You know how they became great Islamic scholars? Because after one generation or two, most of the time, if you convert to Islam in the trans-Saharan slave trade, you would be free. In fact, most of them were freed after one or two generations, and then they would be just part of the kingdom. This is different than the one in the West, where even if you had children with the so-called master, you would still be sold. In fact, this happened a lot. That's why there were so many mixed race slaves. This whole concept is flawed from top to bottom. Saying it's worse, I mean, being under slavery sucks. So I don't even understand if that's supposed to console you. That like, oh, it was a little bit worse for them. That does nothing.
A tremendous diplomatic, military, and monetary cost. Um,
Yes, they started considering it after a bunch of other countries started considering it. They didn't invent being nice to slaves.
And so, this idea that we must eternally apologize for the sins of the past seems to me absolutely ridiculous. Now,
Why does everything have to be so hyperbolic with this guy? Eternally, eternally. It hasn't even been 300 years. And this guy is already considering it eternity. Everything this guy is saying is weird and obviously created from somebody who's trying their best to make a good situation from a bad situation. Also, if we've eternally been condemning the West, then that means that the people have been eternally praising the West, the other people on the other side. So do you believe that they should be praised for eternity? Or does praise, you have to praise something forever, but you have to stop talking about the bad things they did at some point? It doesn't make sense.
does that mean we shouldn't recognize that those things were bad? Yes, of course we should, and we should acknowledge and learn from them. But it seems to me very odd. Again, I made this point in the book. I have a whole chapter on slavery in it, which is
Wow, that must be one interesting book if you don't even know that there were other civilizations that stopped slavery amongst themselves. That's a weird book. I want to read that book.
imagine if you have to, that, 50 years from now, we're all going to be vegan because they get their way, right? Because eating animals is this terrible crime. Uh, would we then say that the people who ended that practice were the most evil in history?
Yes.
That wouldn't make any sense at all. I think we would say, well, this is the first empire in the history of the world that ended this practice we now consider immoral. Good on them.
The reason why this comparison doesn't work is because he's talking about people eating meat as if it's like as natural as slavery. I mean the idea that we're going to implement vegan, where people can get some of these nutrients that they need for their body, is stupid. Veganism doesn't work from a natural point of view.
And by the way, did so for moral reasons. I mean, the abolitionists in England were people who were motivated by a different morality that was developing, which said something about the value of the individual.
The people in Britain did have abolitionism in their mind, and they did eventually push it and eventually get it through. But I don't know why this has to be because of something that happened that was unique to their era. One of the biggest pushes was Christianity, and you keep saying that slavery was this natural thing that no one else saw as a bad thing. Well, how then do you justify or how do you explain the fact that in the Bible there's people like Moses who speaks against slavery of his own people? And I'm not saying Moses was a real person who freed real slaves, but clearly the idea of freeing slaves existed way back then.
Um, so the idea that we would denigrate our history in this way, to me, seems absurd. And every civilization in history, every great empire in history, is built on conquest.
If every civilization in history is built on conquest and conquest is the only way to have a great civilization, then why don't we continue to do it? Why don't we continue to do it today? Continue conquest. And I'm glad he just brought up conquest as a general point, because there's this idea that the worst thing they did was slavery, therefore they did nothing else, and that's what we should come after them for. But also, conquest destabilizing regions. People don't realize that even when slavery was banned, the British Empire continued to expand, reaching its peak in 1920.
This is how the world is. This is human nature, and to pretend otherwise, I think, is very unwise.
Slavery is not human nature. It's artificial. It's as artificial as sliced cheese. What this guy is saying doesn't make any sense.
And it seems that at the moment, Western civilization has never been safer, richer than ever. We should ultimately be ever more self-confident in ourselves, yet we are ever more self-critical about ourselves. Is it just because we've had it too good? Is that what allows us to have that luxury?
Well, it seems
Another excellent softball question. If England is so perfect, then why are we criticizing England? You know, something is going over these guys' heads that I can't believe is literally flying over their heads. If the British never criticized the British, would they have ever thought that slavery was a bad thing? It is because of this aggressive checking of the self that something that good can ever happen, even to the point where people will condemn the nation and call it an evil nation. It's okay if you believe that the people are incorrect about their criticisms, but to say that no one should criticize the UK or Britain or the British Empire because somehow everything is perfect now in the world, and that people have this hatred of nationhood when in real life they have a hatred for evil. But can you imagine trying to make an argument against the evils of slavery as these people have done in this video? That people today who have descendants who were directly affected by slavery should not feel like some bad happened and it should be repaired even today, given the short amount of time since it used to exist.
seems that way. Something I've been thinking about a lot is people are always very suspicious and wary of families that are able to preserve wealth over many generations. The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the whoever's. And I think that's because it's very difficult. The first generation break through and build something special, the second manage it, and the third waste it, basically, is how it tends to go. So to be able to maintain generation upon generation of people who truly value what they have, even though they're growing up in increasing luxury, is very, very difficult. And this is where education comes in. And if we had people who were being educated about the history of their civilization and their society.
What the hell was that comparison? First of all, the Rothschilds and all these other people that you're talking about, of course, people should be suspicious of them. They yield a lot of power in wealth. Why shouldn't they be suspicious of them? And the same should be for the empires, the richest countries. Why shouldn't people be suspicious? Should everyone just turn away and let them operate with impunity, knowing that they hold such great power in their hands? Do you not understand the point of democracy and checking your government and checking people with money and checking for monopolies and all this other stuff? Does it feel like to you suspicion is wrong? Also, what's this got to do with anything? To be honest, like, I'm going to mention something real quick. I think a lot of people, when they talk about things like this, they don't actually, and this is why I don't talk about politics. I don't think they appreciate the fact that they're talking about real human beings who are being affected. And I think they look at it as like a game that is like a chess game to be won. And if you can win the argument, you win everything. And they don't consider the terror. I mean, in this video, we've seen this person basically downplay the horrors that the Europeans basically brang to people who did nothing to them. And of course, he's comparing this to nations where they were attacking their direct neighbors, who it was either us or them. This was not the facts when it came to the European expansions. It wasn't us or them. They just went and killed people who had nothing, people who yielded to them. Some people who bowed down to their religion and yielded to them.
In an accurate way, I think we'd be in a far better place. But what has been happening on Western college campuses and in Western schools for the last many decades is the reason we are where we are.
If the colleges and universities are engaging in propaganda, then nothing has changed. Because before this time, before 1964, which seems to be a pivotal moment for this guy, those same universities were trafficking in high levels of distortion of reality, especially when it came to racial prejudice and all this other stuff. To pretend that it's like something that happened today. You know how many universities protected the British Empire and the stuff that they were doing on the other side? It took several movements in Africa for them to finally realize that they can't hold just any nation. And then their attitude started to change. And them trying to make amends for it now by trying to be critical of themselves so that that stuff never happens again is to you a great act of terror. Do you not understand how ridiculous all that sounds? And you're gonna bring it down to like a jokey word, woke. The world is not a joke. All of this stuff is serious.
One of the reasons why Western civilization has been successful is obviously its capacity to self-criticize, evolve, and improve. Everything you've been talking about tonight doesn't really sound like self-criticism anymore, right? It's something more malign.
I'll be honest, the ability to self-criticize is a small reason why the West is successful today. The real reason why they're successful is because of slavery, because of colonization, and because of exploitative practices in using economy, which is still used today. Like I showed you, they have slaves working for their companies all over the world. Not directly, but they benefit from them and fund them. And they have conflict minerals. They fund conflict minerals everywhere around the world. So that's why they really are a quote unquote great civilization. This guy said it in the beginning. Conquest is one of the best ways for civilization to become huge. This thing of criticizing, that's how you make it better morally.
Does this mean that we can't grow from this, the experience, the challenges that Western civilization is currently facing?
Well, again, let's translate all of this conceptual stuff into simple language. If you talked about your spouse in the way that people talk about their country, people would call you an abuser. If you talked about your spouse in the way that people talk about their country, people would call you an abuser. That's what they'd say. They'd say, "Why are you talking about your wife in this way? That's rude. That's wrong. That's immoral. That's." They would be suspicious of you. But the way that people talk about their own country is perfectly acceptable to do so. So self
Well, yet again, we have a very, and I don't know how to put it another way, a very ignorant point. And I love how the audience was like, over there. Different relationships require different scales. But let's go with the wife narrative that he's going with. Okay, if you talk about your country the way you talk about your wife, you would be considered an abuser if you were the part of the West. Okay, so if your wife abducted people from Africa, enslaved them, and then freed them later, and then went and colonized different nations, genocided a bunch of people, I think it'd be fair to say some harsh words to her. I don't know. Would people really call you an abuser for that? Secondly, uh, if you talk to your kids the way you talk to your wife, they would call you a child molester. What's this point? If you talk to your wife, if you talk to your male friends the way you talk to your wife, people would say you were of a certain type. If you talk to your dog the way you talk to your wife, people would call you another thing. Different relationships require different rhetoric. That's so simple. Why is that a deep? That's not a deep point. Your country is not your wife.
criticism, as I mentioned about freedom of expression, is the bedrock of our progress. The ability to say, no, no, we shouldn't be continuing to do this. Actually, we should be, thinking about how to do this better. But
I love that. It's just like, oh, just some passive thing. Just figure out how to do things better. Let's find out how to do things better. No, it's not about finding how to do things better. Some things require less aggression, and some things require more aggression. Like slavery being overturned required a lot more forcefulness than literally there were boats posted by the British on the shores of some parts of Africa to make sure that other people from their colonies and their enemies, some of their enemies, would not engage in slavery. You know why? Because people from Britain would break the law, would continue to break the law even after they abolished slavery. That was not just, hey, maybe we can do things a little bit better. We've put it in law, and anyone who engages in slavery will be punished harshly. That's not, hey, we'll just do it a little bit better.
it seems to me that we're in the grips of as Christianity has pulled back, we are now in the grips of a new religion that offers no absolution of any kind whatsoever. You cannot do anything to absolve yourself of your straight white male privilege.
I love how he wants to absolve himself of facts. Absolving yourself of guilt is one thing versus absolving yourself of facts. Straight, that's a fact if you're straight. White, another fact if you're white. Privileged, that's a fact if you're privileged. How do you absolve yourself from facts? You can't absolve yourself from things like that. Those are facts. You are in a privileged state because of your history. Probably not you, because I heard this guy is not even from these places. He was underprivileged, I think, in some of these other non-Western states that were destabilized by the West, and then he had to go to the West as a proof that the West is a privileged place. But somehow, in his book, that's like a something that you have to absolve yourself of. Oh, and by the way, the morality part of this. By the way, let's get into it. Gay white people are still not absolved or taken away from the idea that slavery happened under the watch of their nations. It has nothing to do with being straight white male. Females are under the same amount of checking as anybody else. It's the nations and what they did and how they operated. If you take that as a personal insult, that's your problem. And of course, there is one way to make things better. If you want to make it better, it's called reparations. But of course, you would never do anything like that.
There's no way of you. You must just feel forever guilty. And this isn't self-criticism. This is self-denigration, and it's designed for self-destruction. These people, as I say again, are the enemies.
Wow, that was a series of defenses that I can't believe actually exist. That somebody who considers himself very intelligent sat down and came up with these excuses for why their nations. And I love how it's not even a thing of, oh, we are attacking and being attacked for what we're doing today. I love how he pretends that all of the bad stuff is in the past and that today it's over, that the Western world is just, nah, it's good now, everything's so perfect. Why? And the worst part is he's saying, why is it that we're living so good in Europe but we're still checking ourselves? That's because some people in the West care about people who are not in the West. I understand that might be a foreign concept to you, but some people who live in the West care about people who don't live in the West, and they have harsh words for the West when they continue to do terrible things outside of their nations. It doesn't matter how privileged they are.